Well, welcome to lecture number 12. Today's information will include an exploration of both American society and the beginnings of the modern civil rights movement between 1945 and 1961. Essentially, this presentation will be divided into three areas. The first segment will analyze the prosperity in the United States following World War II. It will address issues facing veterans and family life. The second portion will focus on the beginnings of the modern civil rights movement. Lastly, I'd like to explore the other America. Many Americans prospered in the years after World War II, but not everyone. We'll explore how other Americans were in the years following World War II. Here we see an image of the two presidents who were in office during this era. Harry Truman from 1945 to 53, and World War II veteran and the general, Dwight Eisenhower from 1953 to 61. Well, let's explore the Affluent Society first. This award-winning photo from 1945 in many ways embodies the post-war optimism throughout American society in the years following the Second World War. A famous book was published in the years after World War II, and its title was The Affluent Society. And here we see some statistics that characterize American families in 1960. On the left, there's an image showing all of these modern conveniences that were designed to help American families during this era. 60% of American families owned homes. 3/4 of them owned a car, and nearly 90% owned a television by 1960. Some additional statistics are presented here. On the right, we see a chart at identifying the growth in gross national product in the United States between 1929 and 1990. Here we see the real GNP, or gross national product, growing quite a bit. At the same time, average workers' incomes increased by 35%. There were a range of factors that influenced this growth, but one that was really important was the GI Bill. This was passed by Congress in 1944 in order to benefit veterans of the Second World War. First of all, it called for full tuition and spending money for veterans to go to school, particularly to go to college. Also, the government guaranteed loans up to $2,000. People could invest in a home. They could start a business, and it would be very easy for them to get loans for a product like that. There was also something called the 52-20 Club. Well, for up to 1 year, each veteran could get $20 of unemployment. This helped with the transition from being a soldier to a civilian. In many ways, this produced a social revolution in the United States as the middle class grew dramatically. This social revolution transformed the American middle class. In 1929, about a third, just under a third of the American people were considered to be middle class. Well, this about doubled by 1955. By the way, a family with an income between $3,000 and $10,000 a year was considered to be middle class. And on the right, we see a young couple looking at a home. Well, maybe the most tangible example of the growth of the middle class is if a family could actually afford to buy their own home. The GI Bill was one of the major factors that demonstrated this growth in the middle class. However, there were some limits to this. The primary beneficiaries were those veterans. Almost all of the veterans were men, so this helped a lot of men go into the middle class. But it was also legal for colleges to prohibit African Americans or non-whites to enroll in their courses. The GI Bill was not designed to just benefit white males. It wasn't designed to be sexist. It wasn't designed to be racist. But one of the impacts that it had was that it helped white men more than it helped women, and that it helped racial and ethnic minorities. Women could use the GI Bill, but there weren't as many female veterans. The same was true for African Americans. They could use it as well. However, many schools prohibited blacks from entering into their colleges. We'll explore some other aspects of the limits to the GI Bill here in a while. However, next, I'd like to address family life. Access to those low-interest loans led to the rapid growth of new homeowners. Often, they moved to developments in suburban communities. During the decade of the 1950s, about 20 million Americans moved to the suburbs, and we see an example of one with this image on the right. This chart helps to explain some of this expansion into the suburbs. In 1940, about 19.5% of people lived in suburbs. By 1960, it was nearly 31%. So there was a slow, gradual expansion out of inner cities and into these suburbs. While many American families were moving to the suburbs, we see an expansion or growth in the size of the American family. One tendency that we saw during the war and the years immediately after it is that Americans tended to marry at a much younger age. Young women, it was very common for them to marry at 18, 19, 20. And often they started families right away. You see some statistics here dealing with the number of births per 1,000 women and the dramatic increase between 1940 and 1957. Historians have labeled this phenomena dealing with the size of the American family as the baby boom. Baby boomers were children who were born between 1944 and 1964. You see some statistics here dealing with U.S. population growth. Between 1930 and 1939, the population grew between 9 and 10 million. But between 1950 and 1959, we see it growing by 29 million. The size of the American family grew, but there was also a bit of increase in the divorce rate. We'll see a statistic on that here in just a second. This chart identifies the different rates of divorces in the United States over time. In 1940, there were about 2 divorces per every 1,000 people in the population. This peaked in 1945, where the second arrow is, to 3.5. It almost doubled in the same era. By 1950, it had lowered again. However, that 2.6 divorces per 1,000 was actually higher than it had been in 1945. So you see that there is an increase in the number of divorces over time during this era. The baby boom has had a big impact on American society from the time they were born, and it will continue to do so for many years. In the late 1940s, organizations that produced baby carriages, or maybe a company like Gerber or Pampers or things like that, there was a spark in those industries as baby supplies were needed. In the 1950s, we saw a huge boom in school construction for K-12 schools. By the 1960s, college enrollments had ballooned. Also, you see large numbers of students in those colleges, and that's when you see a protest movement as well. By the 1970s, you see another boom in the construction industry, particularly for housing, as many of those baby boomers were starting families of their own. In the 1980s, 90s, even in the early 2000s, you see the stock market skyrocketing as many of those baby boomers hit their peak income levels, in their careers, and they begin to invest in the stock market. As we move on, we might see some of the stresses of the baby boom generation as they begin to draw on Social Security rather than paying into the Social Security Trust Fund. And many older Americans require more health care. So that would be a good industry to get into because many of those baby boomers are going to need care as they get older. Remember that slide that I showed with the statistics about televisions? Nearly 90% of American families owned a television by 1960. Well, there was no going back after that. So as the number of people owning televisions increased, the average television viewing hours increased a lot. And you can see some examples of this here. One thing that was maybe a byproduct of this is that Hollywood was very concerned that people would stay home and they wouldn't go to the movies. So they began producing more and more blockbusters. And so that impacted the motion picture industry as well. If you combine the television with the baby boom, a unique youth culture began to develop in the United States. Popular shows tended to focus on people like in white middle-class families, like the Cleavers from Leave It to Beaver or the Nelsons. We also see, in contrast to some of that, is that there's an increase in the number of juvenile delinquency cases, as a lot of teens began to rebel against their parents, and some people blamed a brand new type of music, rock and roll, which was popular among young baby boomers, as the reason why this young generation of juvenile delinquents was coming of age. Parents pointed to the guy shown here, Elvis the Pelvis, who was very popular among a lot of teens. His record sales increased dramatically during the 1950s. Millions watched him as he appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show. And although there was a generational conflict in the 1920s, it seemed as if another one was coming of age in the 1950s. And in many ways, it foreshadowed the conflict between parents and their children that would be very apparent in the 1960s as young people began to protest the Vietnam War. But that's for the next decade, not in the 50s. Next, we'll switch gears a little bit and talk about civil rights. We'll address phase one of the civil rights movement beginning in 1954, with some background to the movement first. I know this is a little bit of repeat, but remember that Plessy versus Ferguson case described earlier in the semester? Well, that separate but equal doctrine was still the law of the land in the United States. Jim Crow laws, which called for separate waiting rooms, restrooms, and all sorts of things, were common throughout the South, but in many places of the North as well. While those Jim Crow laws may have been legal and spread throughout the rest of the country, World War II had an impact on members of the black community. Many black men served in the armed forces during World War II, and when they came back to the United States, their expectations had changed. They had fought against fascism in Europe or in the Pacific, and so they expected to be treated equally in the years after World War II. One of the big symbolic changes that came about just a couple of years after the war ended, and this happened in Major League Baseball in 1947. In the 1940s and 50s and into the 60s, baseball was the national pastime. Well, in 1947, Jackie Robinson was signed by the Brooklyn Dodgers, and he integrated Major League Baseball. He was a former college student. He had served in the military during the Second World War. He wasn't going to stand for a lot of the segregation that the nation had experienced, and in many ways, he served as a role model for many young African Americans and Americans of any race when he integrated baseball and he played for the Brooklyn Dodgers. The federal government also took steps to bring about more racial equality. In 1947, Harry Truman established a committee in order to investigate issues of civil rights. Then the following year, he called for the desegregation of the armed forces. No longer would white troops and black troops serve in separate units. They would be integrated. Another organization that had been around for a while, the NAACP, began to chip away at segregation. The steps that they took, well, they took those steps through the court system. One of those steps undertaken by the NAACP resulted in what's come to be known as the Brown decision. Linda Brown was a little girl who lived in Kansas, and she was prohibited from going to a school near her home because she was black. Well, her family sued. They didn't think that that was right. Two key individuals played a role in what came to be known as the Brown decision. On the left, we see an image of Thurgood Marshall. He was an attorney who worked for the NAACP, and he was the one who argued the case in front of the Supreme Court. On the right, we see Earl Warren. He was the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. In 1954, the Supreme Court handed down its decision. First of all, they declared that the doctrine of separate but equal had no place in education. Secondly, it prohibited segregation in public schools. Once again, here's that slide dealing with Plessy versus Ferguson that established that separate but equal doctrine. No longer would this be allowed in education. It only dealt with education, but this was an important step forward. It's hard to overestimate the impact of the Brown decision. In many ways, this was the spark that started the modern civil rights movement. If the executive branch wasn't doing enough to promote racial equality, or the legislative branch wasn't, members of the African American community looked toward the judicial branch to try to bring about more racial equality and opportunity for members of the African American community. The Supreme Court may have announced its decision in 1954, but there was widespread resistance to this Supreme Court decision. You can see this with a group that's holding several posters. Some of these say things like race mixing is communism, race mixing is the march of the Antichrist. Most of the resistance was in southern states, but that wasn't the only place where people resisted the integration of public schools. Following the Brown decision in 1954, the Supreme Court also declared that schools had to be desegregated, quote, with all deliberate speed. This did not mean that the schools were integrated right off the bat. In fact, one of the more famous examples of the resistance to the Brown decision and integration took place in Little Rock, Arkansas. On the left, we see an image of Elizabeth Eckford, who went to school and was faced with racial epithets on the very first day of school in 1957. The woman who's showing yelling at her actually was very embarrassed in the years afterwards, and she asked for forgiveness in later years. In order to bring about the integration of the school and to protect those African American students who were entering the school, President Dwight Eisenhower had to send U.S. troops to Little Rock. The image here shows U.S. troops escorting those black students on their way to school. I was lucky enough to visit Little Rock, Arkansas a few years back, and I was able to see the outside of Central High School. It's still an operating school. On the right, you see a little card that says 1 down, 8 to go. Well, those were passed out after one of those Little Rock 9 was suspended from the school for retaliating against students who were calling her racial epithets. And so it was 1 down, 8 to go. Next, we'll continue with the civil rights movement in this era by talking about the bus boycott involving Rosa Parks. The image here shows Rosa Parks. I'm sure many of you are familiar with her activities, but she was riding the bus one day and she was supposed to move to the back of the bus as white patrons began to fill up the bus. She refused to do so, and she was in violation of the law, so she was arrested. The black community mobilized, and they wanted change. Several years ago, I was in Montgomery, Alabama. The image on the left shows me basically right at the spot where Rosa Parks was arrested, and she was taken to the police station. And on the right, you see a big museum in honor of Rosa Parks and the bus boycott. It's actually pretty cool if you ever make it down to Montgomery, Alabama. If you can't make it all the way down to Montgomery, Alabama, you could still see Rosa Parks' bus. It's actually located in the state of Michigan at the Henry Ford Museum outside of Detroit. I was able to visit that, and I learned exactly how the Jim Crow system was set up in Montgomery. Every single person who wanted to ride the bus would go in the front of the bus and they would pay their money. If you were white, you could sit down in the front of the bus. But if you were black, you had to walk out of the bus, walk alongside it, and only go into the bus from the back door. That's how dehumanizing this system was in Montgomery, Alabama. The front section of the bus was for white patrons only. The back section of the bus was for black patrons only. Rosa Parks was sitting in the middle. This is where whites and blacks could both sit. However, if the bus began to fill up with white patrons, if you were black, you had to move to the back of the bus. I'm actually sitting on the very specific seat that Rosa Parks was in when she was arrested. The bus driver came back and said, "You need to move to the back of the bus." She said, "Why do you have to bully us all the time?" He said, "The law is the law." She refused to move to the back of the bus, so he called the police and she was arrested. A new minister rallied people in the African American community. He was new to town. His name was Martin Luther King Jr. He eventually became the leader of this Montgomery bus boycott. I was lucky enough a few years ago to visit Atlanta, and I toured Martin Luther King Jr.'s birth home. You see that on the left. That's where his family lived. He was born there, and he grew up in that area. Not too far from his birth home, just right in the same neighborhood, is his final resting place. And you see an image of that on the right. As a civil rights leader, Martin Luther King Jr. had a particular goal as well as set of tactics to achieve that goal. First of all, he called for the complete integration of blacks into American society. In his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, he hoped that young black children and white children would be able to live together, play together years into the future. The tactic that King also had was by using non-violent protest. He had been influenced by the writings and the actions of individuals like Gandhi, as well as many passages from the New Testament. This non-violent protest was implemented in Montgomery, Alabama, by the fact that he led a boycott of the buses by members of the black community. African Americans refused to ride the buses. They did so for a month, for 3 months, for 6 months, about a year. And then members of the NAACP helped by challenging these segregationist policies throughout the court system. The Supreme Court ended up ruling in their favor, and they called for the integration of the buses after a year. Eventually, the bus companies themselves agreed to hire African Americans as drivers or in other positions within the business. This was another big step in the civil rights movement. The era of the civil rights movement that this lecture is covering is basically phase one. By the mid-1950s, individuals began to question those Jim Crow laws and began to chip away at the legalized segregation in the country. We'll see an expansion of this in the next lecture. The last topic I'd like to address would be the so-called Other America. There was no doubt that the middle class expanded in the years after World War II, and there was a lot of affluence, but not everyone participated in this affluence. This was characterized by a book published in 1962 by Michael Harrington called The Other America. In this book, he studied poverty in the United States. By the early 1960s, there were over 35 million Americans who were living at or below the poverty level, about 22% of the country. Harrington was able to identify kind of a profile of those who were living in poverty in this era. Many people who were in poverty, they lived in inner cities as opposed to those brand new suburbs. There were also more racial and ethnic minorities who were living in poverty as opposed to white families. Many of the families who lived in poverty, well, those were families headed by women, as well as a lot of seniors, people over the age of 60, tended to be more likely to be living in poverty than people who were younger. Remember that GI Bill that I talked about earlier in this presentation? It produced a social revolution, but most of the beneficiaries were white males. It wasn't designed to be racist. It wasn't designed to be sexist, but most of the people who were able to take advantage of it were white. And so a lot of those racial and ethnic minorities who were veterans, well, they were not able to go to college and move up the ladder of success. Following the publication of this book and the realization that not everyone was participating in this affluent society, a president in the mid-1960s would declare war on poverty in the United States. But that's for an upcoming lecture. Well, I'd like to sum up some of the highlights of the presentation next. This presentation has had a few highlights. First of all, the American society after World War II was characterized by affluence. However, not all people were included in this affluence. We also see the beginnings of the modern civil rights movement, particularly by the mid-1950s. Martin Luther King Jr. was the first that I'll talk about here, but we'll explore others in subsequent lectures. What you might want to be able to do is to identify an event or an individual that you think had the biggest impact on the United States in this era. Well, that's it for today. I hope you learned something new. Take care, have a great day, and we'll see you online.